When I was in seminary, I took an introductory Greek class that everybody referred to affectionately as baby Greek. But I can assure you that it was not for babies. Along with everybody else in that class, I struggled to learn the original language of the New Testament, with all its strange letters and sounds, with its difficult verbs and complicated conjugations. One of my fellow strugglers was a guy named Kevin who sat just across the aisle. When Kevin and I ended up serving churches in the same county, we sometimes shared a ride to seminary, and on the way we talked about our work. I had been called as pastor of the First Baptist Church of Newcastle, Kentucky, the county seat, while Kevin, through no fault of his own, was serving a church in the county's armpit. He worked hard. He was a good preacher. He visited the sick. He went to all the deacons' meetings. But in spite of his best efforts, he could not get that church to grow. Week after week, he looked out over a congregation of just a few dozen people. And as we rode to seminary together, he would share his disappointment. I told him that it wasn't his fault. The town in which he was working had once been prominent. It was at the end of the railroad line, and in the days when the trains carried passengers and not just cargo to his town, people had checked into the big hotel right there on Main Street. They had filled up the shops and the stores. But now, his town was at the end of the line in more ways than one. The big hotel had been boarded up. The shops and the streets were empty. It was no surprise that the pews were empty at his church on Sunday morning. But all the explanations in the world wouldn't take away the disappointment he felt every time he stepped into that pulpit and looked out at those empty pews looking back. But then a miracle occurred. My friend Kevin was called to another church, a larger church in a neighboring county. I didn't see him as often after that, but one day he made it a point to drive to my house so we could ride into seminary together so he could tell me how it was going. He said, "Jim, it's wonderful to preach to 300 or 400 people on a Sunday morning with a big choir behind me wearing robes. There are all these wonderful programs going on in the church. They're attracting young couples and families, and people are responding so well to my preaching. I mean, just last week somebody said, if this keeps up, we'll have to expand the parking lot." I have to say, I was genuinely happy for him, especially after all the disappointment he had suffered in his previous church. But then, just before he got out of my car, he turned to me and said, "Jim, if you want your church to grow, you've got to love your people." And I was offended. Not because it isn't true. You do have to love your people, but because Kevin, who had struggled unsuccessfully for years to make a church grow, now pretended to have the secret of success. Whereas before, his ministry had been marked by a kind of earnest humility. Now there was this other thing, this hubris, to use a good Greek word, this kind of arrogance and pride that I found unbecoming in a minister. But then I find a lot of that sort of thing among the church growth experts. In my research for this sermon, I found a comment from a pastor who said that his church had recently gotten involved in a program that described 8 essential qualities of healthy churches and promised with 99.4% certainty that if every congregation could score at least 65 in all 8 categories, then every congregation would grow. It reminded me of the absolute certainty with which one of my seminary textbooks stated that the ratio between parking and people was 1 to 1.75. In other words, for every one place on the parking lot, you could count on 1.75 people in the pews. All of this can make someone like me believe that if I only love my people, if I only get a 65 or better in all 8 categories, if I only have at least one parking place for every 1.75 people I hope to attract, then my church will grow. But it can also make someone like me believe that if I am doing everything the experts recommend and my church is not growing, then there must be something wrong with me. I have a friend who used to serve a church in Dallas, Texas. It was one of those churches that had its heyday back in the 50s when it seemed everyone was going to church. But a congregation that had once numbered in the thousands had now dwindled down to just a few hundred. My friend said that every Sunday when he stood in the pulpit of that cavernous sanctuary, he felt mocked by the empty pews. He read every book he could find on the subject of church growth. He put almost all of those things into practice. He attended seminars led by successful pastors like my friend Kevin. But in the end, he couldn't seem to make the church grow, no matter how much he loved the people. And it was some of those same people who decided that perhaps it was time for him to move on. I wish those people had read this parable from Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29, where Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself, first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come.